He used to laugh at the river, not because it was funny, but because it was the only way to speak to something that never answered. Out here, deep in the Alaskan wilderness, the river wasn't just water. It was a voice, a presence, a test. It could give, and it could take, and a man who forgot that would be swallowed whole before spring. The hunter had lived beside that river for more winters than he could remember. He had watched it freeze thick as a wall, then crack open with the first blush of April light. He had seen men come and go, loggers, trappers, dreamers chasing gold or silence, and he had buried most of them under the same frost that shaped his beard each dawn. Out here things didn't last, except the cold and the memory of mistakes. He wasn't born in this land, though it seemed like the mountain had adopted him the day he stopped fighting it. At first, he tried to live as if Alaska would bend to his will, build traps, catch fish, haul meat, set camp. But the mountain never respected haste. It taught him that every shortcut would cost him double. Every time he thought he'd figured it out, nature would break something, tear something, freeze something, until the day he realized the lesson wasn't about skill. It was about patience. He had to stop trying to win and start trying to listen. That's how the useless trap began. It wasn't a plan, not really. It was a result of silence, observation, and a certain stubbornness that wouldn't let him stop tinkering with failure. He had been fishing for weeks with nothing to show for it but frost-bitten hands, growling stomach. Nets had failed. Hooks froze solid. Even the sled dogs looked at him like they were reconsidering their loyalty. So one night, when the stars were so sharp they looked like they could slice open the night, he carved a shallow hollow into the ice. Nothing fancy, just a depression where the water moved slowest. It wasn't meant to catch anything. He called it his useless hole, a joke whispered to the wind. But that hole changed everything. The next morning, something was different. When he approached the hollow, he saw small flashes beneath the surface, tiny silver movements darting in and out of the space he'd carved. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Then he realized the fish were gathering there, drawn by something he didn't understand. Maybe the shape of the ice made a pocket of warmth. Maybe it disrupted the current in a way that gathered oxygen. Or maybe it was just luck. But luck, he'd learned, only visits men who've waited long enough for. He watched for hours before lowering a crude basket into the hole, barely expecting to hold. When he pulled it up, there were 5 fish inside, then 8, then 12, enough to feed him and the dogs for days. He laughed again, that same cracked sound that only the cold could carve into a man's throat. He laughed at the river, at himself, a strange simplicity of the world when you stopped trying. That hole, the useless, caught more fish in 2 days than all his nets had caught in a month. The story spread later, of course. Out here, even silence carries rumors. Trappers passing through stopped by his cabin, curious to see the strange old man who caught fish through ice without bait or net. Some tried to copy it and failed. Others swore it was witchcraft or luck or the hand of the land itself favoring him. He never explained. He just smiled, stoked his fire, and let them believe whatever made sense, because he knew the truth couldn't be taught. You couldn't sell patience or humility or the art of seeing what others overlook. Life in the Alaskan wilds is a dialogue with the impossible. The cold tests your purpose. The hunger tests your resolve. And the silence, well, that tests who you really are. He had come here years ago thinking he was escaping the world. In truth, the world had never left. It lingered in memory, in regret, in the restless urge to prove something to no one in particular. But the mountain has a way of scraping a man clean of vanity. Out here, you learn quickly what matters: fire, food, shelter, and respect. Everything else burns away like breath on a frozen morning. He used to be someone in a town far, someone with name, job, family, and a set of expectations that always felt too tight for his chest. But that's a story for another part of his tale. What matters now is that he found meaning not in catching fish, but in the stillness that surrounded that useless hole. He realized something profound as he sat by the ice each day. Nature rewards attention, not ambition. The river doesn't care how clever you are, only how patient can be. Sometimes he would sit there for hours after pulling in his catch, just staring into the slow swirl beneath the surface. It reminded him of thought itself, dark, deep, moving, but never still. The ice became a mirror. He could see the reflection of his own choices, the kind of man he had become, stripped of excuses. When you live alone long enough, even failure starts to feel like companionship. You learn to talk to it, to laugh with it, to thank it for keeping you sharp. What most people never understand is that survival isn't about strength. It's about rhythm. Every part of life here moves in cycle. The light, the thaw, the migration of caribou, even loneliness. Once you stop fighting that rhythm, you start living with it. The old hunter's trap worked because it wasn't a trap at all. It was part of that rhythm, a pocket of stillness within motion, just like him. When storms rolled over the ridge, the world turned white and the river disappeared under feet of snow. But beneath it, the current kept moving just as his thoughts did. The cabin creaked, the stove hummed, and the air filled with the smell of smoked fish drying on a rack. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that life doesn't need to be grand to be full. He often thought about how people in the cities spoke of innovation, of progress. Out here, progress meant figuring out how to light a fire when the wood was soaked, or how to read the wind before it turned against you. It wasn't about invention. It was about discovery. The kind of discovery that comes when you let go of control. That's what his ice trap represented. Not cleverness, but surrender. He stopped trying to make nature serve him and started working with it. And in return, nature gave him what he needed. Sometimes he'd talk to the river at dusk, when the sky turned purple and the wolves started calling from the ridge. He'd thank it for the fish, the lesson, for another day, lived in quiet defiance of the cold. He didn't expect. The silence was enough. It meant he was still here, still breathing, still part of something larger than his own survival. Years later, when travelers found his cabin empty, just a pot still warm on the stove, and the old ice hole glimmering faintly under the aurora, they wondered what had become of him. Some said he wandered into the forest and never came back. Others believed he melted into the land itself, his spirit becoming part of the river. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's what happens when a man stops fighting the mountain and starts belonging. But before we go further into who he was and why he came here, I want you to think about something. What would you do if the world you built around yourself suddenly stopped listening to you? If everything you thought you understood about control, success, or comfort was stripped away, and all that remained was the sound of wind against snow? Would you fight it, or would you learn to listen? Because that's where his story begins, not in triumph, but in surrender. And now, before I tell you why he truly came here, before the years of silence and the choice that led him away from everyone he loved, I want you to take a moment. Picture where you are now. Maybe you're watching this from a warm room, maybe smaller, maybe from snow, wherever you tell me. Where are you listening from? He wasn't always a man of silence. Once there had been noise everywhere, machines, conversation, the constant hum of a city that never slept. He had lived among people, worked alongside them, shared meals, laughter, and the kind of empty comfort that comes from routine. For years, he thought that was life. Wake up, work, sleep, repeat. Progress, they called it, security. But inside, something was unraveling. It wasn't a single moment that broke him. It was the accumulation of small things that no one noticed. The disappointment that settled in his bones when he realized that the job he gave his best years to didn't care if he was gone tomorrow. The quiet resentment in his wife's eyes when he came home too tired to talk. The loneliness that grew in rooms full of people. You can live decades like that before you notice the cracks forming under your own feet. He was a craftsman by trade, built tools, fixed machines, shaped things with his hand. But even that, the one thing he took pride in, had become hollow. Everything was faster now, cheaper, replaceable. The men who once stood beside him at the workshop had been replaced by noise and automation. It wasn't progress that he hated. It was the feeling that progress no longer had a place for him. He became quieter, slower, older in spirit long before his body caught up. And when the company folded, when the machines won, and when the people he trusted turned into strangers chasing the next paycheck, he felt something inside him close for good. He tried to adapt, took small jobs, fixed fences, repaired engines, sold what little skill he had left. But everywhere he went, he felt like an intruder in a world that had moved on without him. He stopped talking about his dreams because dreams had become currents, and he was broke. Then came the winter. The man died, taught him how to hold a knife, how to read the sky, how to listen to the woods. They hadn't spoken in years, not since he'd chosen city life over the cabin where he was raised. When he stood by that grave, surrounded by strangers who pretended to mourn, he realized something. The land had been calling him back long before he ever thought to listen. He sold everything he owned that spring, the house, the tools, the furniture, all of it. There was no plan, just a map, an old rifle, and the kind of certainty that only comes when you have nothing left to lose. He left behind a note for his wife, though he doubted she'd read it. She deserved more than a ghost, and he was already halfway gone. People say that isolation is a choice for those who can't handle the world. But for him, it wasn't an escape. It was a return. He wasn't running from life. He was walking back to it. When he reached Alaska, he felt something like recognition. The air cut sharper, the silence heavier, but it wasn't empty. It was alive. Every breath carried the weight of centuries, the echo of men who had stood where he stood now, listening to the wind and realizing how small they were. He built his first shelter by hand, using logs and memory. The work was hard, but for the first time in years, hard felt right. Out here, nothing came easy, and that made every small victory sacred. Lighting a fire with frozen hands, finding food after days of hunger, surviving a storm without losing hope. Each act, however small, stitched him back together. There were nights when regret visited him, quiet and familiar. He would sit by the fire, thinking about the life he had abandoned, the warm kitchen, the laughter of neighbors, the sound of rain on rooftops instead of canvas. But those memories were distant, softened frost. He didn't hate what he left behind, just couldn't live in it anymore. The world he once belonged to, forgotten the language of patience. Everything was instant, disposable, even love. Out here, everything was deliberate. Every movement, every choice. When you split wood, you felt it. When you ate, you remembered the hunt. When you slept, you earned it. The first winter nearly killed him. His traps froze, his firewood ran low, and his body ached from wounds he didn't. Hunger has a way of peeling a man down to his truth. There were moments when he wondered if he had made a mistake, if he should have stayed where it was warm and predictable. But then one night, as he sat under the northern lights, wrapped in a blanket of silence so pure it made his chest ache, he understood why he was there. The cold wasn't the enemy. It was the teacher. It stripped away everything that didn't matter. It left only what was real. He learned to move slower, to breathe with the land. The animals taught him more than any book could. He watched the foxes hunt with patience, the bears wait by the river without desperation, the eagles soar until the right moment to strike. Nature wasted nothing, not time, not effort, not life. And in that balance, he began to see his own reflection. The man who once chased meaning through machines and noise was learning it silent ice. Years passed. he stopped counting them. His hair grew white, his hands rougher. The mountain became his clock, the seasons his calendar. He lived not by deadlines, but by instinct. And though solitude was his constant companion, he was never lonely. Loneliness, he realized, isn't about being alone. It's about being misunderstood. The mountain understood him perfectly. It asked for nothing, demanded everything, and gave in return a peace no human promise could match. Sometimes when traders passed through or hunters crossed his land, they'd ask him why he lived like this. Didn't he miss people? Didn't he miss the comforts of town? He would smile, the kind of smile that carried years behind it, and say, "You can't miss what never made you whole." They didn't always understand, but he didn't expect them to. Some lessons can't be told. They have to be lived. His isolation wasn't punishment. It was a kind of freedom too pure for most to comprehend. Out here, he wasn't defined by success or failure, by what he owned or who he knew. He was defined by his endurance, by his respect for the land, by the quiet discipline that kept him alive. Each sunrise was a reward. Each night survived a victory. The mountain didn't care who he used to be, and that was what saved him. He never spoke much about his family after. Maybe he didn't want to reopen the wound, or maybe he believed that some stories are best left buried in snow. But there were moments, small, fleeting, when something in his expression softened. When he looked out over the valley and saw the light catch the ice just right, he'd whisper something only the wind could hear. Perhaps it was an apology, perhaps it was gratitude. Out here, words had weight, and he used them sparingly. The man who once needed noise now found peace in the hum of wind against the cabin wall. He'd sit for hours carving wood, shaping small figures, foxes, birds, fish, and place them by the window. Maybe it was his way of remembering what he'd lost, or maybe it was his way of proving that creation still had meaning, even in solitude. He built not for money, not for recognition, but for the simple act of making. In that, he found something close to grace. It was during his 5th winter that the useless ice trap came to be. But it wasn't just about fish. It was a reflection of who he had become, a man who had stopped fighting the world and learned to move with it, a man who had traded noise for understanding. Every hollow he carved into the ice was a small confession that sometimes what looks useless to others holds more purpose than anything built in haste. He began to see the trap as a metaphor for his own life. People had once called him a fool for leaving everything behind. They said his isolation was madness, that he'd end up a ghost in the snow. But like the hole in the ice, his solitude gathered life. It brought meaning to a place others thought barren. The mountain had given him what the city never could, truth stripped of illusion. So when travelers asked him if he ever planned to return, he'd answer the same way every time. You don't return from where you were meant to be. That wasn't arrogant. It was peace. He had found the rhythm that the rest of the world had forgotten, and once you hear that rhythm, you can't unhear it. And now, before I tell you about how his life settled into that silence, the quiet morning, the snow that spoke louder than words, and the wisdom he gathered from each frozen dawn. If you've been listening so far and feel something stirring, subscribe to the channel, because the next part of this story isn't just about survival. It's about what happens when a man stops running from silence and starts living inside it. The first true lesson of the mountain is that silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything that most people never hear. The sigh of snow settling on branches, the low groan of ice shifting deep beneath the river, the distant cry of a raven marking the end of daylight. First, those sounds are strange, even unsettling. A man fresh from the world of engines and chatter feels them as loneliness, but given time, they start to shape him. Silence becomes a kind of companion, steady, demanding, honest. It doesn't flatter, it doesn't argue, It doesn't pretend. It simply reflects what you bring to it. His cabin sat on the edge of a long, frozen valley where the wind funneled through like a whisper from the sea. Each morning, he would rise stir the embers from the night's fire, and step outside with his breath turning silver against the dawn. The dogs, old now and slow, would stretch beside him. He'd check the sky, always the sky. Out here, everything you needed to know. Clouds spoke of storm. The shape of the light told you how long you had before nightfall. And sometime, on the cold, when the air was still and the frost hung heavy, you could hear the ice on the rivers, a deep, hollow note that echoed through your bones like a heartbeat. His days followed a rhythm older than any. The work was endless, but never rushed. Split, melt snow, mend the roof, check the smoke, gather moss for the stove. It was a cycle of necessity, but it carried something spiritual. Every task reminded him of the same truth. Life is earned, not owned. And though it might look simple from the outside, simplicity is the hardest thing to master. It requires clarity, patience, and a heart unbothered by time. He spoke little, even to himself. Words seemed unnecessary in a place where everything spoke through silence. Instead, he thought in sensations, the crunch of boots on snow, the heat of fire on his face, the sting of wind against his skin. When he did speak, it was to the land itself. A quiet thank you when a trap yielded meat, a brief murmur to the river when the ice held strong, a wordless nod to the stars when the night passed safely. He believed that if you live long enough in one place, it starts to recognize. The land stops resisting. It starts to teach. He had no clock, no schedule, no need for them. His hunger, the light, told him when to act. The mountain decided the rest. There's a strange kind of peace in surrendering control. Most men fear it. They call it vulnerability. But out here, surrender isn't weakness. It's wisdom. You can't fight the cold. You can only respect it. You can't command the river. You can only read it. Every storm, every long night, every broken trap became a teacher. Each lesson cost him something. It gave back more than it took. Sometimes, when the snow came heavy and he was trapped inside for days, he would sit by the small window and watch the world disappear. The trees blurred into white, the river vanished, and all that remained was the slow dance of flakes against glass. Those were his favorite moments. The stillness reminded him of the truth that had taken him years to accept. You don't have to move to live. Growth can happen in stillness, just as fish gather in the slowest waters. The world had taught him to chase, to strive, to compete. The mountain taught him to wait. There were nights when the aurora stretched across the sky like green smoke, shifting and trembling as if the heavens themselves were alive. He'd sit outside in the snow, his fur coat heavy on his shoulders, the dogs curled at his feet, and stare until his eyes watered. The colors would move, fade, return like breath. He used to think of them as spirits, voices of those who had walked this land before him. Some nights, when the lights danced brighter than usual, he'd feel his father there just behind the shimmer, watching silently. It didn't frighten him. It comforted him. The living and the dead shared the same sky, after all. The mountain kept them both. The silence also brought memories he thought he had buried for good. Sometimes, still of dawn, he'd remember his wife's voice calling him for breakfast, the warmth of a cup of coffee he didn't appreciate at the time, the laughter of neighbors from across a fence. At first, those memories hurt, sharp and unwanted. But over time, they softened. They stopped being wounds and became stories, the kind you hold gently, not out of regret, but out of respect for what once was. He realized that love doesn't disappear when you leave. It just changes. It becomes part of the land that holds you. He began keeping a small journal, not for anyone to read, but as a way to mark the passing of his thoughts. He wrote in short lines, almost like prayers. Snow deep today, river whispering again. Saw wolf tracks near the ridge. And sometimes, when he felt the weight of solitude too strongly, he'd add, still here, still thankful. Those words, scratched in pencil on old paper, were enough to remind him that even isolation could be full of meaning. No matter how small it looks from the outside, is always a story worth recording. The animals became his company. A fox that often lingered near the cabin, a raven that perched on his roof each morning waiting for scraps. Even the wolves, distant but ever present, became part of his world. He watched and learned from them their patience, their loyalty, their unspoken understanding of balance. They never took more than they never killed. The wild had its own morality, one far older and fairer than anything written by man. He noticed that the more he lived in silence, the more he began to understand movement. The way snow fell told him when a storm was coming. The way the river's current shifted told him when spring would break. He no longer looked at nature as separate from himself. He was part of it, and it was part of him. That realization changed everything. The fear that once haunted him faded. The loneliness turned into solitude, and solitude, in its purest form, became joy. One morning, as he was checking the traps along the frozen edge of the river, he stopped to watch the sunrise. The light came slow, spilling gold over the ice, turning every frozen branch into a blade of fire. It was so beautiful it hurt. He stood there, breathing steam into the air, feeling time dissolve around him. That's when he understood what all the silence had been leading him toward. Not escape, survival, presence, to be so fully in a moment that nothing else exists. Not the past, not the future, not even the self. Just the sound of the wind, the pulse of the earth, the light on the snow. That was life in its purest form. He didn't crave company anymore, but he never closed his door. Sometimes a traveler would appear, lost, weary, searching for warmth. He would share what little he had, a bowl of fish stew, a corner by the story. They often asked him why he lived this way. Because I finally stopped running. That sentence stayed with people. Some came back months later, changed, quieter, more aware. Others never returned, perhaps afraid of what silence might show them. But he never judged. The mountain calls each person differently. His useless trap continued to feed him through every winter. He never altered it, never improved it, as if tampering with it might break the spell. It was a reminder of everything he had learned, how simplicity triumphs over cleverness, how patience outlasts force, how surrender leads to abundance. He knew someday the hole would freeze over completely, or the river would shift, and the fish would stop coming. But that didn't trouble him. Nothing lasts forever. The beauty of things lies impermanent. Evenings were his favorite. When the fire glowed low and the world turned blue with twilight, he'd sit by the door. The snow would fall in a hush that felt sacred. He'd think about all the people out there chasing something, money, fame, comfort, and wonder if they ever stopped to listen to the sound of their own existence. The silence taught him that most of what people call meaning is just distraction. True meaning doesn't shout, it whispers. You just have to be still enough to hear it. And so his life became a conversation with a man who once thought silence was emptiness, discovered that it was the fullest thing in the world. It held memory, wisdom, peace, truth. It held the rhythm of his breath and the song of the land. And it held him gently, like a part of itself. Now that you've heard how his days turned into years of stillness and understanding, how every storm became a lesson and every silence a teacher, the next part of this story will bring the moment that tested everything he had learned, the challenge that would show whether a man of peace could face the mountain's greatest trial, still remain whole. It happened during a winter that refused to end, the kind that doesn't just freeze the land, it freezes time. The river had been buried under ice so thick it looked like stone, and even the wind seemed tired of howling. He had seen hard winters before, but this one carried a different weight, like the mountain was testing him, asking how much he truly understood about endurance. Food was running low, the dogs were old, and the his faithful miracle, had gone silent. For weeks, nothing stirred beneath it. The river that had once been alive with silver movement looked empty, still, lifeless. At first, he waited, trusting the rhythm that had always guided him. But as the days dragged on and the smoke from his chimney grew thinner, he realized patience alone would not be enough this time. The world was holding its breath. Even the birds had stopped singing. He felt it deep in his bones, stillness before something break. So he began to walk farther than usual, beyond the familiar ridges, searching for signs for any whisper of movement that might feed him through what remained of the snow was waist-deep, cruel, blinding under the dim sun. Each step was an effort, each breath a reminder the air itself could wound you. He followed the river downstream, where the current was supposed to be stronger, thinking perhaps fish fled there hours. His legs burned, his beard froze into a crust of white, and still he found nothing but silence. He could have turned back, but pride and necessity are two sides of the same blade. He pressed on until the light began to fade, and the cold crept through his boots. Then he saw it, a faint shimmer under like something breathing where no life should be. He knelt and brushed away the snow, revealing a small pocket of water where the current carved out a hollow. It reminded him of the first useless hole he had made years ago. He smiled despite himself. Maybe the land was mocking him, or maybe it was offering him another chance. He took his knife, carved the ice wider, and waited. Hours passed. The stars came out. The wind died completely. And then, just as he began to doubt, a flash of silver appeared below. One, then another. The fish had found this hollow too. He laughed, not loudly, but with that quiet disbelief that comes when the impossible reminds you it's still. He lowered a line, caught 2 fish, then 3 and 4. Enough to eat, enough to live. But before he could pack up and leave, he noticed something strange. The fish that came from this hole were different, larger, their scales reflecting the starlight with a faint green glow, almost as if the northern lights themselves had touched. It wasn't something he had ever seen before. He brought them back to the cabin, cleaned them, cooked one over the fire, and tasted. The flavor was pure, sharp, unlike anything he had known. It filled him with warmth that seemed to reach beyond his stomach all the way to his hands and feet alive. He didn't know if it was the hunger or something deeper, but he felt the mountain speaking through that, as if the land itself had chosen to feed him one last time in its own mysterious way. Over the next days, he returned to the hollow again and again. Each time, the fish were there, and each time they seemed to glow brighter. He didn't take more than he needed, and never more than a few. But every time he left, he felt stronger, clearer, more awake. He began to wonder what made them gather there, what hidden rhythm of the river had led them to that small pool. Perhaps some underground spring had opened, warming the water. Perhaps it was just nature's way of rewarding patience once again. But deep down, he sensed there was something else, a mystery beyond explanation, the kind that reminds a man of his place in the order of things. One night, as he was walking back from the river, the northern lights began to blaze across the sky. They moved faster than usual, rippling green and blue and violet. The air vibrated faintly, like the hum of something unseen. He stopped to watch, and in that moment, he felt a strange clarity. It wasn't a voice he heard, not in the way men hear voices, but a thought rising from the silence itself. The mountain, the river, sky, they were all part of the same living thing, and he was in, not separate, not above it, but a single breath within a vast lung. He understood then that survival was never about conquest. It was about harmony. That revelation should have been enough, but the mountain wasn't finished with him yet. A storm arrived without warning, the kind that erases the world. The sky turned gray, then black, and the wind came down the valley like a living wall. He barely made it back to the cabin. Snow slammed against the wall. The roof moaned, and for the first time in years, he felt fear, not for death, but for being forgotten. The dogs huddled close, whimpering. He fed the fire, rationed the wood, waited. Hours became days. The storm did not end. When it finally broke, the world outside was unrecognized. The river was buried, the trees bent, the path to the hollow gone. He stepped into a silence so deep it felt wrong. No birds, no wind, no sign of life. It was as if the world had paused to see what he would do next. He followed the path to where the hollow had been, pushing through snow that reached his chest. When he arrived, the hole was gone, buried under a thick crust of ice. He dropped to his knees, scraped, dug, and carved until his hands bled. But the river remained sealed. He sat there, exhausted, staring at the unbroken ice. That's when he noticed something shimmering beneath it. Faint green pulse, moving slowly along the current. The same glow as fish, but deeper, almost like light breathing under the frozen skin of the earth. He pressed his palm against the ice just for a moment. Felt warm. It was enough to remind him that even when buried, life continues, that beneath every silence, there's movement. Beneath every ending, continuation. He didn't try to open the ice again. He understood now that some things aren't meant to be touched twice. The trap, the fish, the light, they were gifts, not possession. Trying to keep them would break their meaning. He rose, looked at sky, and whispered a thank you that vanished into the wind. Then he walked back to the cabin, leaving the hollow untouched, his footprints filling slowly with snow behind him. Spring came late but brilliant. The melt was strong. The river roared back to life, and the land seemed to breathe again. Flowers pushed through the soil as if nothing had happened, as if the storm had been only a dream. When he returned to the river, the hollow was gone completely. The current had moved on. The place that had once fed him was now part of the endless flow. He smiled. He understood. The river was teaching him the final lesson, that nothing we build lasts forever. And that's the beauty of it. Years later, when the few travelers who knew of him came asking about the glowing fish, he told them only this: sometimes the mountain gives you a miracle to see if you can let it go. They didn't understand. They wanted proof, a story with an ending that could be measured and retold. But the mountain doesn't speak in answers. It speaks in signs, in moments that vanish. He never saw those fish again, but something in him changed permanent. He moved through his days calmer, as if part of him had dissolved into the current that once. He knew then isn't always finding new. Sometimes it's about seeing in a new way. The ice had the glowing fish taught him. The storm had taught him surrender, and together they had revealed the truth he'd been seeking since the day he left civilization, that peace is not found in comfort, but in alignment with what is real. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on what you have or who you're with, but on how deeply you can listen to the silence. And if you've been walking this far with him, if you felt the cold, the stillness, and the strange beauty of a man who found meaning where others see emptiness, take a moment now. Subscribe to the channel so you don't lose your place in this journey, because what comes next isn't about discovery anymore. It's about reflection, the moment when a man looks at the life he's lived and sees the truth of it all written in the snow. There comes a point when a man no longer counts the years he has lived, but the seasons he has endured. The hunter had reached that point long ago. Time no longer moved in numbers or calendars, but in colors. The white of winter, the gold of autumn, the deep blue of long summer. He had grown into the rhythm of the land until his heart beat with the same quiet tempo as the river under the eye. He no longer needed to measure life in moments of excitement, change. It was enough simply to exist within the flow, to wake each day and know that he belonged exactly where he stood. But the mind, even in solitude, never stopped searching for meaning. In the calm years that followed the great storm, he found himself reflecting more often. The silence that once knew how to listen now began to ask questions. He'd sit outside the dusk, his breath turning soft in the air, and watch the light fade over the world below him looked untouched, eternal. But he knew better. Everything changes, even what seems most permanent. and he wondered what kind of mark, if any, a man like him leaves behind. He had come here believing the world was broken, too fast, too loud, too careless, and maybe it was. But as the years stretched on, he realized the world wasn't the enemy. It was the people within it who had forgotten how to see. They had turned life into a race, meaning into a product, beauty into distraction. They built machines to fill silence, schedules to replace wonder, and called that progress. Yet, the more they created, the less they seemed to understand. He had lived that way once too, mistaking noise for purpose, mistaking motion for growth. The mountain had stripped that illusion from him, layer by layer, until nothing was left the raw truth. That peace isn't something you build, it's something you uncover. He thought often about how different the world would look if everyone spent one winter alone with no one press prove. If they were forced to sit in silence long enough to hear their own, long enough to feel the earth breathing beneath them. Most would break before the snow. But those who didn't, those who could endure the quiet, would never be the same. They'd return with softer eyes and slower hands. They'd understand that nothing we own is truly ours, and that the simplest things, fire, warmth, stillness, are worth more than anything made by men. Sometimes traders would bring him news from the world below. They spoke of new machines, new wars, new promises of change. He'd listen politely, nodding, though most of it sounded like the same story told in different words. He didn't blame them. It's easy to get lost and the noise never stopped. He would offer them tea, share a story about the river or the dogs, and send them on their way. They always left quieter than they came, as if the silence of his world clung to them for a while before fading. One trader once asked him if he ever felt lonely, not for people, but for meaning. The question lingered in the air like smoke. He thought about it for a long moment, then said, "Meaning isn't something you find. It's something that grows around you when you stop needing answers." The man didn't understand. Most people didn't, but that was all right. Some truths aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be lived. He began to see that the mountain itself was a reflection of the human heart. Harsh, vast, unpredictable, and yet capable of breathtaking beauty when treated with respect. The snow that could kill you was the same snow that made the world silent and pure. The wind that stripped trees bare was the same wind that cleared the sky to reveal the stars. Balance existed in everything, even in suffering. The trick was not to resist it. He had learned to find beauty in every difficulty. When his hands ached from the cold, he saw it as a reminder that he still felt. When food ran scarce, it taught him gratitude. When storms broke his shelter, they reminded him that nothing stays perfect for long, and that was all right. Perfection is a kind of death. It leaves no room for growth. The mountain, in its constant motion and imperfection, was alive. So was he. Sometimes at night, he'd remember the city, not in bitterness, but with quiet curiosity. He wondered how people could live surrounded by so much sound and still feel so empty. He wondered if they ever looked at the stars or if they had forgotten the sky altogether. He thought of the faces rushing through streets, eyes glued to glowing screens, hearts beating too fast to feel anything real. He pitied them, not because they were lost, but because they didn't even know. But he also felt compassion. He had been one of them once. He knew the hunger that drives a man to fill silence with. He knew how easy it is to confuse comfort with peace. That was why he never spoke with judgment. The mountain had humbled him too much for that. He understood now that every man walks his own path to understand, and most never. But maybe that's all right too. Maybe the world needs both the restless still, the noise without one. The other loses meaning. He saw life as a circle. Everything fed into everything. The trees fell, became soil. The rivers froze. The bodies that died again fed the roots of new growth. Even his own existence felt circular. His first years full of motion, his later years full of stillness, and somewhere in between, a brief moment of clarity where he had seen the world as it truly was. He often thought that maybe life's purpose isn't to achieve, to return to the earth, to simplicity truth. When he looked at the younger hunters who sometimes passed through, he saw the same fire he once carried, the need to prove something, to conquer, to survive through sheer will. He never tried to stop them. The mountain would teach them in its own time. All he told them was this: you don't understand. Learn from it. Some listened, most didn't, but he had planted the seed, and that was enough. He also began to notice how the mountain itself had changed. The glaciers had retreated a little. The summers grew warmer, the winters shorter. The animals moved differently. He didn't need scientists to tell him the world was shifting. He could feel it in his bones. He wondered what would happen when the mountain grew tired of man's carelessness. Maybe one day it would shake them all like dust, and maybe that wouldn't be tragedy, but balance, restoring it. Nature always finds a way back to silence, spite never despair. If anything, he felt more peace than ever. He had lived long enough to see that destruction and creation are not enemies. They are partners. The world breaks so it can rebuild. He too had broken once, and it was the breaking that had saved him. The pain that drove him here had been necessary. Without it, he never would have heard the silence guided his every. He often sat by the river where the old ice trap used to be. It was gone, erased by years of thaw and calm. But in his mind, he could still see it. The small hollow, the glowing fish, the moment of discovery that had changed everything. That memory had become his prayer. It reminded him that the simplest acts often hold the deepest truths, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from invention, surrender. As he grew older, his movement slowed, his hands trembled, but his heart remained steady. He no longer feared the end. Death didn't feel like an interruption, but a continuation of the same rhythm that had carried him all his life. Just another season. He didn't imagine heaven or judgment. He imagined becoming part of the land, the wind, the snow, the river. That was enough. And perhaps that's the greatest reflection of all, that a man can live an entire life searching for meaning only to realize that meaning was never hiding from him. It was waiting for him to be quiet enough to see it. The world doesn't owe us understanding. It offers it freely. We just have to listen. He smiled more in those final years, not out of joy exactly, but out of recognition, the kind of smile that says, I understand now, the kind that belongs to men who have seen both the noise of the world and the peace of the mountain and chosen the latter. And now, as we move toward the end of his story, the silence and the legacy he left behind, remember that his life wasn't about escape. It was about belonging, about one man finding in the heart of isolation the truth the rest of us spend a life. The last winter came quietly, without warning or fury, like an old friend arriving unannounced. By then his hair was the same color as snow, and his steps had grown slow but steady. The mountain no longer felt like a challenge to him. It felt like home, in the truest sense of the word. The air, sharp and clean, filled his lungs with the same calm it always had, but there was something different in it now, a kind of knowing, a softness that comes when a man has nothing left to prove and everything left to appreciate. He had built a life from nothing, carved it out of ice and patience, and he knew it was nearing its natural close. He didn't dread it. He simply observed it, the way he had learned to observe everything else. Each day, he woke before dawn, tended to the fire, and walked down to the river that had once fed him. The useless trap was long gone, but the river still whispered beneath the ice. He would kneel there, listen, and whisper back. It wasn't prayer, it was gratitude for the years, for the lesson, for the silence that had given him everything he never knew he needed. His world had grown smaller with age, but richer in meaning. The dogs were gone now, buried beside the cabin under smooth stones he'd carried one by one. He had outlived everyone he once knew, his wife, his family, the few friends who'd stayed in touch through fading letters. Sometimes he wondered if anyone even remembered his name. It didn't sadden him. Names fade, but the things we give to the world, small or large, remain in ways we can't always. The smoke of his fire had mixed with the cloud. The wood he chopped had become soil. The fish bones he buried had fed the earth. His existence had left a trace, even if no one could name it. That was enough. In his final years, the mountain gave him the greatest gift of all, clarity without words. He no longer needed to think, explain, or everything simply was. The world didn't need to be understood. It only needed to be seen. He realized that all his life he had been searching for connection, not with people, but with truth. And now, sitting in front of his small cabin, surrounded by endless snow and light, he knew he had found it. When spring came that last time, the melt slower than usual. The river crept back to life as if waking from a long sleep. He spent his days watching it, remembering every season it had carried him through. There was a moment, one morning, when he thought he saw movement under the ice again, a faint shimmer like years ago. He leaned closer, smiling, half expecting to see the glowing fish return. But there was nothing, only light reflecting off the water. Still, that was enough to make him laugh softly. The mountain didn't need to give him miracles anymore. It had already given him understanding. He began to write more in his journal, though the words came slower. His handwriting trembled, but his thoughts were clear. He wrote about the first winter, about the trap, about the glowing fish, about the storm that nearly buried him. But most of all, he wrote about the silence, how it had become the greatest teacher of all. The world, he wrote in one entry, is loud because it fears what silence will say. He hoped that one day someone might find his word, not to praise them, but to remember what listening means. He spent the last weeks preparing, not in sorrow, but in care. He cleaned the cabin, sharpened his tools, set his few belongings neatly by the wall. He left extra firewood stacked near the stove, knowing the next traveler who came through might need it. He mended his coat, fed the fire one last time, and sat by the door with his cup of tea, watching the sunset. The sky burned gold and orange, the snow shimmered with the last light of day, and the air carried that faint scent of thaw that signals spring's return. It was beautiful, achingly so, and he felt his heart swell with that night. As the fire faded to embers, he lay down on his cot, wrapped in the same blanket he'd carried from his father's cabin decades ago. He didn't think of death. He thought of the river, the fox, the dog, the stars, the glowing fish. He thought of the sound of wind against snow and how it had shaped every thought he'd ever had since coming here. His breath slowed, his eyes closed, and in that final moment, he smiled, not out of victory, out of recognition. The mountain had taken him back. When the spring thaw reached his cabin, a small group of trappers found it by accident. The door creaked open easily. Inside, everything was neat, quiet, untouched. The pot still hung over the stove, blackened clean. The tools were lined along the wall, each one oiled and sharp. On the table sat a small leather journal. Its last page, the final words read, "The silence was never empty. It was full of everything I had been too loud to hear." They buried him beside the river, under the same stones that marked the graves of. One of them said a few words, though they felt the mountain had already spoken for him. The wind carried the sound of the river below, and for a moment it almost seemed soft, steady, alive. The men stood there longer than they intended, each feeling something they couldn't quite name. When they left, they took nothing, not even the journal. It belonged there, among the trees and the snow and the stillness. Years passed, and his cabin slowly disappeared back into the land. The wood softened, the roof caved, the river shifted its path, but the place never lost its presence. Travelers who passed through the valley often said they felt something there, a calm, a weight, a kind of peace that made them speak softer without knowing why. Some claimed they heard the faint sound of water under ice. Others swore they saw a light flicker beneath the river on cold nights. Whether it was truth or imagination didn't matter. What mattered was that the silence he had lived became the silence that remained. His story, the one of the useless trap that caught more fish than any net, began to travel far beyond the valley. It was told and retold, twisted by rumor and wonder. Some said the trap was magic. Others believed it was a metaphor for patience, humility, or something sacred. The truth didn't need to be corrected. Stories, like rivers, change shape as they move. What mattered was that people still told it. Somewhere in their retelling, they kept a piece of him alive. And maybe that was his legacy. Not the cabin, the journal, not even the trap, but the reminder stillness is not the same as emptiness. That life doesn't always reward speed or noise or ambition. Sometimes it rewards the man who waits, the man who listens, the man who dares to live where no one else does, and in doing learns that the world's most profound truths found not in quiet. Perhaps even now his spirit walks along the riverbank at dawn, listening to the water, feeling the wind. Perhaps he's part of the current, part of the snow, part of the eternal silence that holds everything together. The mountain doesn't keep men, it transforms them. It takes their noise and returns it as peace, and that is exactly what it did with him. So, when you look at the world around you, at the noise, the rush, the endless hunger for more, remember the man who carved a hole in the ice and found meaning in what others called useless. Remember that life's richest gifts often come in the simplest forms, and that silence is not an absence to be filled, but a space to be understood. And if his story spoke to you, if something in it made you pause for a moment and listen a little deeper, then honor that feeling. Leave a comment below, share where you're watching from, subscribe to the channel, and keep this story alive. Because maybe the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more listeners.